The instruments flashed frantically on the instrument panel as the Boeing 757 plummeted in freefall at an altitude of 10,000 meters. In the cockpit, Captain Richards was unconscious, flood blood pouring from a cut on his forehead. Slayan co-pilot Bradley struggled alone with the unresponsive controls. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Pacific Airlines Flight 837. We have lost complete control of the aircraft," Bradley shouted into the radio, his voice trembling with sheer panic. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, 342 people were living their last moments of terror. Oxygen masks swung violently, fluggage flew through the aisles, and desperate screams echoed throughout the aircraft. But there was someone there who wasn't screaming. 34-year-old Diana Foster remained calm in seat 16A, watching every movement of the falling aircraft with the technical precision of someone who had spent 15 years flying military fighter jets. Her eyes automatically analyzed the angles of descent, the wind speed, and the behavior of the control surfaces. She wasn't just watching the disaster unfold. She was calculating solutions. Just 2 hours earlier, Diana had tried to introduce herself to the flight crew at the airport. As a certified commercial pilot and former Air Force officer, it was standard protocol to identify herself when flying as a passenger. But Captain Richards had barely glanced at her. "Oh sure, another flight attendant who thinks she's a pilot?" he had muttered to Bradley loud enough for Diana to hear. "These diversity quotas are getting out of hand. Let her sit back there and pretend she knows anything about flying." Bradley had laughed. "Next thing you know, they'll want women flying aircraft carriers too." Diana hadn't responded. She had just smiled politely and headed for her seat, storing the humiliation as fuel for something greater. What those men didn't know was that she had been the first black woman to fly the F-22 Raptor fighter jet in combat missions. With over 3,000 hours of flight time and a specialization in impossible emergency landings. Now, as the plane plummeted and the same men who had despised her screamed for help in the cockpit, Diana unbuckled her seatbelt with a calmness that frightened the passengers around her. Her movements were precise, calculated, as if she already knew exactly what was going to happen. The flight attendant rushed down the aisle, trying to calm the panicked passengers. Diana gently took her by the arm. "I need to get to the cockpit, now." "Ma'am, all passengers must remain seated during the emergency," shouted the flight attendant, her voice competing with the deafening noise of the alarms. Diana looked directly into the desperate woman's eyes. "I'm a certified pilot, former Air Force. If you want to have any chance of surviving, get me there." For a moment that lasted an eternity, the flight attendant hesitated. Then something in Diana's calm, determined gaze convinced her. She nodded and began to make her way through the chaotic aisle. As she walked toward the cockpit, where the same men who had humiliated her now fought desperately against death, Diana couldn't help but smile. Riley, if you're enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple humiliation would turn into the moment that would change the lives of everyone on board forever. As Diana walked down the aisle toward the cockpit, the passenger screams of terror mingled with a deafening sound of alarms. But her mind was focused on something far beyond the chaos around her. She was reliving every second of that humiliation from 2 hours ago. At the boarding gate, Captain Richards had been even crueler than she had initially realized. When Diana approached politely to identify herself as a certified pilot, he hadn't even looked at her pilot's license. "Look at this, Bradley," he had said, turning to the co-pilot with a mocking smile. "Another one of those diversity pilots who showed up after they changed the rules. I bet she flew a Cessna 152 twice, and now she thinks she's Top Gun." Bradley had laughed too loudly. "Man, remember that woman last month? She said she was experienced and almost crashed the plane taxiing to the runway. These quotas are becoming a joke." "Exactly," Richards continued, now speaking directly to Diana as if she were a child. "Honey, I know you want to feel important, but this is serious business. Let the men do the work, okay?" What hurt the most wasn't the words, but the laughter. Other pilots passing by the gate began to pay attention to the comedy. One of them had even taken a discreet photo, probably to share in the WhatsApp group with a joke about another woman who thinks she's a pilot. Diana had swallowed the humiliation in silence, But inside, a flame was igniting. They had no idea who they were belittling. Diana Foster wasn't just any pilot. She was the only black woman to have commanded rescue missions in hostile territory in Afghanistan. She had landed damaged fighter jets on makeshift runways under enemy fire. She had more flight hours in extreme situations than Richards and Bradley combined. But the worst was yet to come. As she walked away, Richards had shouted loud enough for half the airport to hear, "Hey, princess, when you grow up and want to fly for real, come find me. Maybe I'll let you clean my cockpit." The laughter that followed echoed through the terminal like a public slap in the face. Passengers turned to look. Children asked their parents what was going on. Diana felt every pitying glance, every whisper of "poor girl." Now, 2 hours later, as she opened the cockpit door, where the same men who had humiliated her were fighting desperately for their lives, Diana couldn't help but notice the cruel irony of fate. Bradley was alone at the controls, sweat pouring down his face, his hand shaking violently on the controls. Richards lay unconscious, blood streaming from a deep cut on his forehead where he had hit it during the first violent turbulence. "I can't do it! I can't do it!" Bradley shouted into the radio. "We've lost everything. Hydraulics, electrical, navigation. We're in free fall." When Diana entered the cockpit, Bradley looked at her in utter despair, not recognizing her immediately. "Are you a pilot? Please tell me you know what you're doing." For a brief moment, Diana considered reminding him exactly who she was. She considered mentioning the comments about diversity quotas and princess. She considered letting the weight of the irony crush him completely. But 342 lives were in her hands. "Get out of the chair," she said with a calmness that contrasted brutally with his panic. "Now." Bradley hesitated for a second, his eyes finally recognizing the face of the woman he had humiliated at the airport. The shock was visible. The same princess they had told to grow up was now literally the only thing between them and certain death. "You," he stammered. "The diversity pilot who's going to save your life," Diana finished, taking the controls with precise, confident movements. Every new humiliation she had suffered in the last few hours only fueled something inside her that those arrogant men couldn't see, a determination forged in the fire of 1,000 battles they would never have the courage to face. What they didn't know was that every word of contempt had only prepared the ground for the moment when they would discover who was really in charge. Diana took control of the Boeing with the precision of a surgeon. Her fingers slid across the instruments with a familiarity that left Bradley speechless. Every movement was calculated, confident, as if she had been born in that cockpit. "Stabilizing altitude at 8,000 meters, she murmured, adjusting the flaps manually. "Main hydraulic system is dead, but the secondary is still responding. Bradley, I need you to monitor the fuel pressure while I work the flight controls." Bradley obeyed automatically, his hands still shaking. The contrast was brutal. 2 hours ago, he had been mocking her as a quota pilot. Now, he depended on her for his survival. But what really haunted Diana wasn't just Richards and Bradley's insults. It was the reaction of everyone else at the airport who had witnessed the humiliation. When Richards shouted, "Hey, princess, maybe I'll let you clean my cockpit," 4 other Pacific Airlines pilots at the gate burst out laughing. One of them had even discreetly filmed it on his cell phone, probably to share with the company's Real Pilots group. "Man, that was good," laughed Captain Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the company. "These women think flying is like driving an Uber." The worst part was when Flight Supervisor Rebecca Walsh, one of the few women in a position of authority, walked past the group and said absolutely nothing. She just lowered her eyes and quickened her pace as if she hadn't seen or heard anything. The sisterhood Diana had hoped to find simply didn't exist when prejudice came from above. "Let her try," Richards had said, loud enough for Diana to hear. "When she crashes on her first serious turbulence, she'll remember that a woman's place is serving coffee, not flying planes." What none of them knew was that Diana Foster had flown rescue missions in hostile territory for 5 years straight. She had landed damaged F-22s on makeshift runways under enemy fire in Afghanistan. Her hands had guided aircraft through sandstorms that blinded instruments, through war zones where one miscalculation meant instant death. She had graduated first in her class at the Air Force Academy, breaking accuracy records in emergency simulations. Her instructors called her liquid ice, cool under pressure, but fluid in any situation. Now, as she stabilized the Boeing in freefall, Diana couldn't help but smile. Riley, first serious turbulence, Richards had said. Well, here she was. Diana, Bradley said, his voice more respectful now. I've never seen anyone take the controls like that. Where did you learn that? She didn't even look at him. In places where men like you and Richards would never dare to set foot. The truth was that Diana had left the Air Force, not because of incompetence, but out of frustration. After 5 years of saving lives and serving her country, she had been passed over for promotion 3 times in a row, always for white men with less experience and worse evaluations. The official explanation was always the same: needs to develop more leadership or needs to demonstrate greater command over troops. When she finally received a promotion, it was to an administrative position away from the skies, away from the action. Basically a closet where the most decorated military officer in her class could be discreetly forgotten. It was then that Diana made the most difficult decision of her life, to leave her military career and try civil aviation. She thought that in the private sector merit would speak louder than prejudice. How wrong she was. Critical fuel, Bradley announced, interrupting her memories. We have maybe 15 minutes of flight time. Diana looked out the cockpit window. Below them, only snow-covered mountains and dense forests stretched to the horizon. There were no major airports for 300 kilometers in any direction. But there was something she had noticed on the map during the safety briefing. A piece of information her military training had taught her to always memorize. A small abandoned military airstrip built during the Cold War and forgotten by modern civilian maps. Bradley, I want you to contact Denver Air Traffic Control. Tell them we're declaring a maximum emergency and we need all available rescue resources directed to the coordinates I'm about to give you. What coordinates? There's nothing in this region. Diana adjusted the plane's course with a smooth but determined movement. Trust me, or would you rather I call Richards to take over? Bradley looked at the still unconscious captain and shook his head quickly. No, you're in charge. For the first time since she had entered the cockpit, Diana smiled genuinely. Now you understand. What Bradley didn't know was that Diana wasn't just flying the plane. She was executing a plan that had begun to form in her mind the moment Richards had humiliated her at the airport. Not a plan for revenge, but something much more powerful, a plan for total redemption. Every movement she made on the controls was calculated not only to save the plane, but to prove irrefutably that the men who had despised her had made the biggest mistake of their professional lives. The woman they had called princess and told to grow up now held in her hands not only 342 lives, but the professional fate of every man who had doubted her competence. And Diana Foster was about to turn the most painful humiliation of her life into the most spectacular victory civil aviation had ever witnessed. With only 12 minutes of fuel left, Diana spotted the abandoned military runway emerging from the mountains like a gray scar in the middle of the white vastness. 1,200 meters of cracked concrete, exactly half the length needed for a Boeing 757 under normal conditions. That's suicide, Bradley muttered, his hands sweating on the secondary controls. No commercial pilot would attempt that. Diana adjusted the flaps manually, her eyes calculating impossible angles of descent. You're right. No commercial pilot would attempt that. What Bradley didn't understand was that Diana Foster wasn't just a commercial pilot. She was a war veteran who had landed damaged fighter jets on makeshift runways under enemy fire in Afghanistan. She had commanded rescue missions where a miscalculation meant instant death for her team. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 837 on final approach for an emergency landing, Bradley transmitted, his voice breaking. Flight 837, this is Denver Tower. Confirm attempt to land on abandoned military runway section 16. That runway is not authorized for commercial aircraft. Diana took the radio from Bradley's trembling hands. Denver Tower. This is Commander Diana Foster. certified Air Force officer with authorization for emergency landings on military territory. I declare a state of maximum emergency and assume full responsibility for this operation." A tense silence filled the radio. Then, "Commander Foster, we have confirmed your identification on our records. Clearance granted. Good luck." Bradley looked at Diana with wide eyes. "Commander, you're a military officer." At that moment, Captain Richards began to regain consciousness, moaning softly as he tried to focus his blurry eyes. "What? Where are we?" "Richards," Bradley said, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and reverence. "The passenger, she's an Air Force commander. She's trying to save us." Richards tried to sit up, blood still trickling down his forehead. His eyes found Diana at the main controls, and slowly realization began to form in his confused mind. The same woman he had humiliated, called a princess, and told to grow up, was now commanding a landing operation that few pilots in the world would have dared to attempt. "No, it can't be," whispered Richards, the color draining completely from his face. Diana kept her eyes fixed on the instruments. 6 minutes to impact. "Bradley, I want you monitoring descent speed. Richards, if you can stay conscious, watch the hydraulic pressure." The plane cut through the low clouds, revealing the military runway below as a narrow line defying physics. Diana adjusted the controls with surgical precision, each movement calculated based on thousands of hours of experience in impossible situations. "Speed 180 knots, 170, 160, muttered Bradley, his voice mesmerized by the absolute competence he was witnessing. In the passenger cabin, a deadly silence had taken hold. 342 people felt the plane descending at an angle that defied everything they knew about commercial flight, yet somehow maintaining a stability that could only come from exceptionally experienced hands. 50 meters, 40, 30. Bradley continued the count, his voice now filled with awe and terror. Diana pulled the nose of the plane up at the last second, executing a perfect flare that softened the impact. The main wheels touched the concrete with a deafening roar, followed by the nose wheel. Immediately, she applied the reverse brakes with full force. The Boeing slid down the short runway like a bullet, sparks flying from the overheated wheels. Diana maintained complete control of the aircraft, adjusting direction with micro movements of the rudder pedal. With only 50 meters of runway remaining, the plane finally came to a stop. Absolute silence filled the cockpit. Bradley stared at Diana as if he were seeing a ghost. Her hands shook violently as she removed her headset. I've never seen anything like that in my life." Richards, now completely lucid, was in a state of complete shock. The man who 2 hours earlier had mocked her as a quota pilot had just witnessed the most technically perfect landing of his 20-year career. How did you do that?" Richards asked, his voice a broken whisper. Diana methodically shut down the main systems, each movement demonstrating the competence those men had been too arrogant to recognize. 15 years of military training, 5 years commanding combat missions, 3,500 hours of flight time in extreme conditions. She turned to face them directly. "Everything you could have found out if you bothered to look at my qualifications instead of assuming I was just another diversity pilot." The cockpit door opened, and the flight attendant entered, tears streaming down her face. "Commander Foster, all passengers are accounted for. Emergency services are on their way." "Commander Foster," Richards repeated, the final realization hitting him like a slap in the face. You really are the first black woman to command F-22 fighters in hostile territory?" Diana added calmly. "Awarded the Medal of Honor for 5 successful rescue missions? Certified instructor for extreme emergency landings?" Bradley buried his face in his hands. My God, what have we done? Outside, ambulance and fire engine sirens drew closer. Red and blue lights began to illuminate the cabin, but inside the cockpit, only the weight of complete humiliation and justice served at the perfect temperature hung in the air. "You called me princess," Diana said, rising from her chair with absolute dignity. "You said women like me are only good for cleaning cockpits." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. Well, I just cleaned up the mess you made. Richards tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The woman he had publicly disparaged had just saved his life, and the lives of 341 others, with a display of skill he could never hope to match. As rescue crews approached and the reality of what had happened began to sink in, a single truth echoed in the silence of that cockpit. The same competence they had been too arrogant to recognize was now impossible to ignore, and the whole world was about to find out exactly who the real professionals in that cockpit were. 6 months after the miraculous landing that saved 342 lives, Diana Foster stood on the main stage of the International Aviation Convention, receiving a standing ovation from more than 5,000 pilots and airline executives from around the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the president of the World Pilots Association, "I present to you Captain Diana Foster, the first person in the history of civil aviation to perform an emergency landing on an abandoned military runway without losing a single life." The ovation lasted a full 4 minutes. Camera flashes lit up the auditorium as Diana, now wearing the official uniform of Pacific Airlines captain, the same company where she had been humiliated, walked with absolute dignity to the microphone. "7 months ago," she began, her voice echoing through the silent auditorium, "2 men told me that a woman's place was serving coffee, not flying planes." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. "Today, I command Pacific Airlines' emergency fleet and train pilots for extreme situations." In the audience, hidden in the back rows, Richards watched with his face buried in his hands. After the emergency landing, an internal investigation by Pacific Airlines had revealed not only her technical incompetence during the crisis, but also a history of discriminatory behavior documented by several female employees over the years. The administrative inquiry found that Richards had falsified flight hours on his resume and that his commercial pilot's license had technically expired 2 years earlier. The company, trying to avoid a bigger scandal, had quietly fired him for disciplinary reasons. No other airline would hire him. Bradley, for his part, had been demoted to co-pilot on short-haul domestic flights. During internal depositions, several colleagues reported his misogynistic and racist behavior, including the incident at the airport that had been partially filmed by passengers and went viral on social media with the hashtag #PrejudicedPilot. "Aviation is not about gender, color, or social background," Diana continued from the stage. "It's about competence, training, and the courage to make the right decisions under extreme pressure." The transformation at Pacific Airlines had been radical. The company, initially trying to downplay the scandal, was forced to completely reevaluate its policies after public pressure. Diana was not only promoted to chief pilot, but now also headed the company's new diversity and excellence in aviation program. 9 women and 15 people from ethnic minorities have joined our pilot team in the last 6 months, Pacific Airlines CEO had announced the previous week. And our incident rate has dropped to 0 since we implemented the new training protocols developed by Captain Foster. The training program Diana had created based on her military experience and combat situations had become a global benchmark. Airlines from 43 countries requested licensing for her methods. The Foster Protocol was now mandatory material in aviation schools. On stage at the convention, Diana looked directly into the camera, broadcasting live to 120 countries. "To every black girl who has ever been told she wasn't leadership material, to every woman who has ever heard she didn't have the profile, I say, your competence will speak louder than any prejudice." The audience erupted in applause again. On social media, the video had already racked up millions of views, with comments from women around the world sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity. Rebecca Walsh, the supervisor who had witnessed Diana's humiliation at the airport and done nothing, resigned from Pacific Airlines a week after the incident. In an interview with a newspaper, she admitted, "I didn't have the courage to stand up for what was right. Living with that cowardice after seeing her greatness made it impossible for me to continue at the company." 3 of the 4 pilots who laughed at Diana's humiliation at the gate were transferred to night cargo flights, the lowest position in the commercial aviation hierarchy. The fourth requested a transfer to another company when his own colleagues began to isolate him socially. But the most important change, Diana continued, did not happen in meeting rooms or training manuals. It happened in the minds of an entire generation of young people who now know that the sky has no gender or color limits. The Diana Foster Foundation for Inclusive Aviation, created with the money from the international award she received, had already awarded aviation scholarships to 230 young women from marginalized communities. 15 of them had already graduated and were working as commercial pilots. Richards, still in the audience, rose discreetly and began to leave the auditorium. He couldn't watch anymore. His own arrogance had created the legend that now haunted him every day. In WhatsApp groups for pilots, his name had become synonymous with incompetence. His wife had filed for divorce after the video of his humiliation went viral in his social circles. "There is one final lesson I learned on that terrible day," Diana said, concluding her speech. "The best revenge is never to destroy those who hurt you. The best revenge is to become so extraordinarily competent that the very existence of your success exposes the smallness of those who doubted you." Diana stepped off the stage to a 10-minute standing ovation. Reporters immediately surrounded her, but she walked straight past them toward a group of 15 young pilots, all Black, Latina, and Asian women, waiting in their new Pacific Airlines uniforms. "Ready for your first flight as captains?" Diana asked, smiling. "Yes, ma'am," they replied in unison, proud in the knowledge that they were making history. As they walked together toward the hangars, Diana thought of Richards and Bradley. She felt no anger or cruel satisfaction at their downfall. She felt only pity for men so small that they needed to belittle others to feel big. Diana Foster's real victory was not landing a plane in impossible conditions. It was proving that competence and character always win out over prejudice and arrogance. If this story of overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of people who turned humiliation into fuel for greatness. Because sometimes the injustice we suffer today is just the universe preparing us for the glory we deserve.